Chapter 17 brings us into the Renaissance and Baroque Europe. The techniques and attitudes developed during this time period remained important all the way through the 20th century. And we're going to start off learning about the Renaissance, and this movement began around the 14th century and continued into the 17th century. This was basically a huge shift in attitude in Europe. So the religious wave of the Middle Ages has become increasingly challenged by logical thought and new philosophical, literary, and artistic movement. And so this is known as humanism. This kind of shift from God and afterlife has come to more be about humankind and the here and now. And this continues to influence us today. This leads to individualism, modern sciences, and technology. For art during this time period, we see new and more specific scientific approaches to represent accuracy. The intellectuals actually identified this era as their own era, and it was known as a rebirth. Painting and sculptures were no longer supplements to architecture, and the anonymous workers of the Middle Ages became seen as individuals and creative geniuses. And so the North and South developed very differently over time because they have different backgrounds, attitudes, and experiences, such as Northern Europe. We see the Gothic style and evolved out of Christian and nature-centered religions. And then Southern Europe, we see the Byzantine and Greco-Roman style and this more Mediterranean emphasis on human-centered and more idealized. And so that's going to influence the Renaissance and how they develop their artwork. This piece here is what your chapter starts off with, and this is a great example of the beginning of this new humanistic art. This is the Italian Giotto. In this painting, they're starting to portray feelings and the physical nature of humans. It's very innovative on its light, space, and mass creation. And we have this new sense of realism. We're trying to portray the physical as well as the spiritual reality here in this painting. And so we have this very shallow, stage-like feel. And they're trying to portray the feeling of grief, which was rarely seen in medieval art. In medieval art, we're trying to, have this all-powerful, all-knowing type of sense of our Christian art, but now we're starting to see more realistic feelings such as grief. Giotto is a precursor to the Renaissance and basically the reinventor of naturalistic painting, which had not been seen since the decline of Rome around 1,000 years earlier. So just to recap, remember the Greeks idealized this physical form. The Romans were more interested in physical accuracy, the characteristics of each person. The Middle Ages was based on spirituality rather than the physical existence. And then now during the Renaissance, this attention is going to be brought back down from heaven to earth. And so even our Christian subjects in our artwork are going to be in more human-like terms. So first we're going to look at Renaissance in Italy. Italy is the homeland of the Renaissance. And during this time, Italy has a very flourishing economy, and that kind of helps to spread the Renaissance movement. We have merchants now and other religious or non-religious important people in the community that have a lot of money that are able to compete with one another to kind of have artists work for them. And so not only is it church officials, as we've seen before, or royalty that can pay artists, but now we have these other intellectuals, these other people in the community that have enough money to be able to be art patrons. And we see this new study of anatomy and light. We see the first use of linear perspective, and we see art and science really working hand in hand. Art really helps and aids the growth of science during this time period. And so we're going to look at three influential artists, Masaccio, Donatello, and Botticelli during this time in Italy. First, we have Masaccio. He's the first major Italian Renaissance painter. Here we see a composition centered on an open chapel. And we see the Trinity at the top, God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is the white dove. In the niche, we see Mary and St. John. Kneeling outside the niche are the donors who paid for painting this painting. It's a husband and wife of they're actually powerful bankers in the community. The man is wearing a red robe, and so we know he is Florence City Council. And then at the very bottom, we see a skeleton with the inscription, I was what you are, and what I am you shall become. And so from top to bottom, the artist is trying to express this spiritual all the way down to physical presence. And so this is the first painting based on the systematic use of linear perspective. The vanishing point is actually below the base of the cross, which would actually be right at the viewer's eye level. And so it's this very believable extension into space, this very lifelike. The arches are Renaissance arches, and they're Roman prototypes, so we see that Roman influence there. Another thing that's really interesting is the physical presence of these people. When we looked at that painting just a second ago by Giotto, the body and the fabric hanging over the body just almost seemed to be one, kind of this one blob. It didn't necessarily look like there was a body underneath it. It just looked like a pile of fabric. But in Masaccia's piece here, we can actually tell that there are bodies underneath these draped fabrics. And so the garments actually drape how garments would drape if you had it on. So for example, on Jesus's legs, you can see that the fabric is laying over legs and there's actual legs underneath there. And on the other people, you can see, especially in the arms, where the fabric is being held up and it looks very realistic, that there's actual physical presence underneath that fabric. So next we have the Birth of Venus. This was a private commission by the Medici family, and so this was part of the group of people in the community that supported the art. But this is actually a painting of the Roman goddess of love just after she was born in the sea. She's being blown to shore by a couple, which is supposed to symbolize wind, and greeted by a young woman who represents spring. And so we see these very graceful lines, which are actually a Byzantine influence. We have this very decorative and flat background, so there's not much allusion to deep space. It actually appears to be in relief, where it looks like the background is completely flat and these figures are almost placed on top of this background. So it's not fully three-dimensional. They have postures of modesty, especially Venus here in the center. And remember that Medici Venus that we looked at earlier from Greece? This sculpture was actually owned by the Medici family during this time period, and so Botticelli actually looked at that sculpture to paint this painting, and so that's why they're so similar. And so this painting combines this idea of this Greek idealized human figure with this Renaissance concern for thought and feeling. And so this painting is pretty revolutionary. It's a nude pagan goddess, and it's in the center of the painting. And through the medieval ages, back into the fall of Rome, that has been pretty much Mary's spot. Mary is the most important, and so she would be in the center. And so now we have this pagan goddess in the center. And so where this comes from is the Medici family and the circle of intellectuals that they were part of actually subscribed to a thought of Neoplatonistic philosophy. And they had a lot of focus on Greek mythology, but they believed that all sources, from the Bible to Greek mythology to magic to mysticism, were inspirational and a means of ascending from earthly existence into a mystical union with the divine. And so this idea of beauty and thought and feeling was what they believed to be the most important, and that's what they supported in the arts with their money, and that's what they commissioned to be created. So next we have the High Renaissance. This began around 1490, and this is really when Italian art peaked. we start to see art becoming very calm, balanced, and idealized. And we see this combination of Christian theology with Greek philosophy and science of the day. And so we're going to see some influential artists such as Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Leonardo da Vinci was very influential in science and art. He was just very knowledgeable and thirsted for knowledge. As you can see here, you can see a page in his sketchbook and just see how investigative and creative his mind worked. And so here we see some studies of anatomy and also some mechanical devices. He was pretty much on the forefront of scientific development during this time period. And this drawing here, the babe in the womb, actually has very few errors and is a great example for medical textbooks even today. So he is very knowledgeable of science. I'm sure many of you have seen the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. It's come to be much of a cliche for art, and there are many spoofs on this painting. But it's still very interesting, and I think that's why it keeps everyone's attention, and we keep seeing it coming up over and over again in the art world. So we see this very mysterious mood that Da Vinci paints in this painting, and Mona Lisa almost has this faint smile. There's this strange kind of otherworldly landscape. You can't really place where this takes place. This ambiguity is enhanced by this hazy light, this fuzzy atmosphere that Da Vinci creates. And so he actually invented this special type of chiaroscuro where he would have these very subtle gradations of value and almost blurs the edge of the image. And it's not quite known who had been Da Vinci because of the bone structure, or it could have been made up. There's many ideas of what it could be, but it's obviously a portrait of an individual, which was pretty common during ancient Rome and was unknown during the medieval period, and now we see it coming back during the Renaissance, this importance of the individual. Another example of the impact that the Renaissance humanism had on art is Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Jesus sits across the table from the viewer. And so you can see this is a rather large painting, and so if you were to walk up to this painting, you would be across the table from Jesus. And so Jesus becomes this very accessible person, and the disciples would look just like us. It would look just like how we would look during this time period. And so instead of this lofty, powerful being of heaven, it's more this accessible person to us. And Leonardo uses a very naturalistic style with hidden geometry. He uses one-point perspective, with the center being behind Christ's head. Christ is the center of this painting and the most important thing, and so obviously the emphasis will be on him, and so the linear perspective point. And then he also uses another type of emphasis where we see this stoic triangle that Jesus makes with his hands on the table, and then all the other shapes around him that his disciples make are much more organic and free-flowing, and so they all kind of flow back towards Jesus in the center of the table also. And so this is kind of having Christ as this accepting, stable triangle in the center of this painting. And so this is supposed to depict the final meal before going to the cross. So during this time period, Pope Julius II wanted to redecorate his private prayer room. And so that was actually, the Sistine Chapel was his private prayer room. And so he ordered sculptor Michelangelo to take this painting commission. And so Michelangelo, as you'll read in your book, was actually deemed the greatest sculptor of all time right before this because of his sculpture of David. And then the Pope basically orders him to paint the top of the Sistine Chapel. Well, the Sistine Chapel is very famous, and he was very reluctant to actually do this, and so it's very interesting to know that Michelangelo didn't even want to create this. But he actually took 4 years for him to complete this. It was done in fresco style, which remember we learned about in the painting chapter of our book. And this is one of the panels, the creation of Adam, which we've probably seen parts of it or all of it before. You could probably buy it at Hobby Lobby. And so it's very popular. And so this is actually a painting of God reaching to give life to the first man, Adam, there on the left. Eve is not yet mortal, and so he's behind God's arm on the right-hand side of the painting. And this story actually does not exist in the Bible. The Pope actually wanted to tell this story of the relationship of God and the Renaissance people. And so this is a very Renaissance humanistic concept of God. He's this kind of idealized, rational man who actively tends to his creation and the special interest in humans. So next, we Northern Europe. We see this kind of parallel in realism, but we're more depicting real life here in Northern Europe during this time period. We're going to look at two influential artists, Jan van Eyck, which was the leading painter of oil painting and developed it to how we use oil painting today, and then also Peter Bruegel. So here's the Arnolfini portrait. This is a painting we saw a detail of earlier on in the semester when we were looking at texture. This is probably one of Jan van Eyck's most famous artworks, and it's actually a wedding or a betrothal contract for marriage. We see ordinary objects portrayed with great care, kind of this sacred significance to ordinary objects. We see a lot of symbolism, such as the single lighted candle to symbolize the presence of Christ. Amber beads and sunlight symbolize purity. Dog, marital fidelity. The bride holding up her skirt is the willingness to bear children. Her green dress, which was very common for a wedding ceremony during this time, is supposed to symbolize fertility. And Van Eyck was actually painted himself into the painting. There's a reflection of himself in the mirror in the back of the room, and then he actually signed his name above the mirror as a witness to this event, and so his signature and date is above the mirror. And so figures in space are accurately captured. And in Northern Europe, they were trying to depict everyday life, and so they wanted their paintings to look like you're looking through a doorway just over into the next room. They want them to be very realistic and similar to their own world that they live in. So Bruegel developed this new artistic vision of a landscape. This was in Northern Europe, all over France and Italy, and developed this very broad sense of composition and spatial depth. He painted lives and the surroundings of the common people. These are called genre paintings. They're basically paintings that dignified everyday life. And so we see this use of atmospheric perspective like we've never seen before. He's done a lot of traveling. He knows what it looks like when you look out into this vast space, and so he's able to replicate that in these paintings here. He actually painted scenes representing the 12 months of the year. This here, Hunters in the Snow, is January. He followed a precedent set by medieval manuscript painters, and so each month is depicted by their agricultural labor. And so this is actually a winter month, and so obviously things are not growing, and so these are the hunters getting ready to go out and hunt. And so now we see this new emphasis on the mood of nature rather than on humans. And then it's also known for its deep illusion of space. So just for a second, I wanted to look at, on the left here, we have this medieval manuscript that I spoke of that Bruegel was influenced by. And this was during the late Gothic period. And so we see this very different depiction of space. We don't see as much depth, obviously. And but we also see this very different depiction of time. Remember, time is linear in our Western culture, and so we have this path here on the left, and the people have different moments along this path depicting time. And so even though both of these paintings have great attention to everyday detail about life and nature, Bruegel has much more developed depth, and then he also is using time a little bit differently. It's more of like a photograph, a snapshot of time, where it depicts this one moment, but it still tells a story. You know that bird is flying. You can see the people skating down there. You know the hunters are going out to hunt. And so we still have this concept of time, but it's just from one vantage point. And so this leads us into the Baroque period. This starts around 1600, and so art changes pretty drastically during this time period. We see a lot more drama in this time period, and we see a different use of light and scale and composition, a lot of sharp angles, a lot of sharp diagonals, and extreme foreshortening, which I'll show you an example of in just one moment. And so there's a lot of influential artists during this Baroque period. This is after the end of the Renaissance. So we see Caravaggio, Bernini, Rubens, Velázquez, Vermeer, and Rembrandt during the Baroque period. So here we have the conversion of St. Paul. Here's an example of foreshortening, which is highly developed during this Baroque period. And that is actually where Paul is laying down at the bottom. And he looks like he's coming out towards the viewer rather than going back into space. And so this is known as foreshortening, where it looks like the figures are entering into your space. Paul is actually being pushed to the foreground. He feels like he's right there in front of you. And so he wanted... Caravaggio wanted to create a mystical dimension in an ordinary world. And so this is the conversion of St. Paul, but it looks very ordinary to what you would see during this time period. This was actually rejected by the clergy because they believed the emotional realism was too strong for the everyday people to be able to handle. And so even though artists didn't necessarily work for the church during this time, you can see they had a lot of influence over the art world. And Caravaggio was pretty much known for this emotional realism and this extreme chiaroscuro, this extreme light and dark, where it almost looks like a spotlight is shining on the figure. And these are some basic qualities of Baroque art. Next we have Bernini, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And I would encourage you to watch this YouTube video to really see the entire piece. It is a huge, large-scale piece in a cathedral. And also hear the people talking about this piece in its actual environment. And so Saint Teresa would have visions, and this is a depiction of one of her visions of an angel coming to see her. And it's basically a great example of Baroque drama and exaggeration, because they're using a metaphor basically that an orgasm is what's being depicted here, and that's what they associate this wonderful feeling of God's love. And so that's the human metaphor for God's love, and so that's what this is depicting here. Rubens actually traveled on a trip to see Michelangelo and Caravaggio's work, and this was a result of that trip, this painting. And so we can see details from Flemish heritage, much like Van Eyck's painting, but we see the same action and drama as Caravaggio's painting, with Christ as being led upward onto the cross. And so we have this sharp angle once again going up the cross, but we also have this foreshortening of the men at the end of the cross, where they look like they're coming into your space. And then last we have Velázquez. This is the Maids of Honor. And Velázquez actually worked for nobility. He worked for the King of Spain. And this painting here has a lot of that same Baroque style. We see this very different use of composition where everything's kind of in the bottom half of the composition, and this very intense use of lights and darks. But what's interesting about this painting is that it's actually a royal portrait. And so when you first look at the painting, you see Velázquez there, and he's looking out from a canvas. And so you're standing behind the canvas. And so it's a little bit of a trick. Am I the subject? Who is he painting? And you look into the back of the room, and there's a large mirror there. And you actually see you're standing in the place of the king and queen. And so he is actually painting the king and queen. The girl in white in the center is actually the royal daughter, and those are all her maids around her. And so this is a very innovative idea for a royal portrait. And so this is just one of the examples of how artists are starting to become creative and their own individuals. And the King of Spain during this time was, pretty hip and let Velázquez actually do this. And so Velázquez was able to be a little more creative than some of the other royal portraits.